Dr. Yuna Kim sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of research papers and glowing data screens. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through her xenobiology notes for the 100th time that morning. Today wasn't just another day in the lab. Today would change everything humanity knew about alien life. The research vessel. Harmony floated silently in the darkness of space, positioned exactly at the coordinates both species had agreed upon months ago. Through the massive viewing windows, Yuna could see nothing but stars and the endless black void. But somewhere out there, an alien ship was approaching. The first aliens humanity would ever meet face to face. Yuna had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. She'd studied every piece of information Earth's long-range scanners had gathered about the Kethval species. She'd learned their basics, language, memorized their cultural protocols, and read countless reports about their society. But reading about aliens and actually meeting one were completely different things. Captain Minsu Park's voice crackled through the ship's communication. "System. All hands prepare for first contact. The Kethval vessel will dock in approximately 1 hour." Yuna's stomach fluttered with nervous excitement. As the ship's lead cultural specialist, she would be the first human to actually speak with an alien being. The responsibility felt overwhelming. What if she said something wrong? What if she accidentally offended them? The entire future of human-alien relations might depend on how well this first meeting went. She walked through the corridors of the Harmony, observing her fellow crew members going about their daily routines. Engineer Jimin was laughing with his girlfriend near the cafeteria. Medical Officer Sujin was humming while she organized her supplies. Communications Specialist Taehyung was playing cards with 3 other crew members, joking and teasing each other good-naturedly. These simple human interactions would soon seem very strange to their alien visitor. According to all the intelligence reports, the Kethval species lived very differently than humans. They didn't laugh together or show affection casually. They didn't touch each other unless absolutely necessary. Their entire approach to relationships was cold, calculated, and purely practical. For the Kethval, intimate relationships existed for one reason only: making babies. They scheduled their romantic encounters like business meetings. They chose partners based on genetic compatibility rather than emotional connection. The idea of kissing someone just because you cared about them, or holding hands while walking, or hugging a friend who felt sad would seem completely pointless to them. Yuna tried to imagine living that way. No spontaneous kisses, no cuddling. On the couch while watching movies. No romantic dinners just for fun. No physical affection without a specific biological purpose. It sounded incredibly lonely. The ship's alert system chimed, and Captain Park announced that the alien vessel had arrived. Through the docking bay windows, Yuna caught her first glimpse of Kethval technology. Their ship looked nothing like human. Vessels. Where human ships had curves and organic shapes, the alien craft appeared to be made entirely of sharp angles and geometric patterns. It looked more like a floating mathematical equation than a spaceship. 20 minutes later, Yuna stood in the main meeting chamber, trying to calm her racing heart. The room had been carefully prepared according to Kethval preferences. The lighting was dimmed to match their home planet's conditions. The temperature had been lowered 15 degrees. All decorative elements had been removed, leaving only functional furniture arranged in precise geometric patterns. A shimmering light began to form in the center of the room. Yuna held her breath as the alien transportation technology activated. The light grew brighter and began to take shape. Slowly, the figure of Velana materialized before her eyes. The alien woman was tall and elegant, standing at least 7 feet high. Her skin had a subtle silvery tone that seemed to shift and change in the light. Her movements were graceful but strangely mechanical, as if every gesture had been carefully calculated for maximum efficiency. There was no warmth in her posture, no casual relaxation in her stance. She stood perfectly straight, her hands positioned at precise angles by her sides. Velana's large dark eyes studied Yuna with obvious curiosity, but her expression remained completely neutral. When she spoke, her voice came through a small translation device attached to her collar. The words were clear and precise, but completely without emotion. "Dr. Kim," she said, "I am here to study your species' reproductive inefficiencies." The next morning, Yuna found Velana standing motionless in the corridor outside the engineering bay, her scanning device beeping softly as she recorded data. The alien woman's attention was focused entirely on engineer Jimin Park, who was saying goodbye to his boyfriend before starting his 12-hour shift. Jimin leaned in and gave his partner a quick, gentle kiss on the lips. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, nothing dramatic or passionate, just a simple expression of love before they separated for the day. To any human watching, it was the most normal thing in the world, but Velana's device started making rapid clicking sounds, and her eyes widened with what looked like complete confusion. She immediately approached Yuna, her voice filled with urgent curiosity. "Dr. Kim, I require immediate clarification about the interaction I just observed." Yuna smiled, already guessing what had caught the alien's attention. "What would you like to know?" The male human pressed his mouth against another male's mouth for approximately 2.7 seconds, Velana reported, consulting her scanning device. "My instruments detected no exchange of genetic material, no reproductive cells were transferred, no fertilization could possibly result from this contact. Yet immediately afterward, both subjects showed significant changes in their brain chemistry." She looked up from her device, genuinely puzzled. The stress hormone cortisol dropped by 12% in both individuals. Their heart rates synchronized. Oxytocin levels increased dramatically, but I cannot identify any biological purpose for this behavior. Was this some form of medical treatment? Yuna couldn't help but laugh at the clinical way Velana described a simple goodbye kiss. No, it wasn't medical treatment. They were showing affection to each other. Affection, Velana repeated the word slowly, as if testing how it sounded. "Please define this term." "It's a way of expressing care and love," Yuna explained. "Humans touch each other to show emotional connection, not just for reproduction." Velana made several notes on her device, clearly struggling to understand. "But this is highly inefficient. They wasted energy and time on an action that produces no measurable benefit." "Actually, it did produce benefits," Yuna pointed out. "You said their stress levels went down, and they felt happier afterward. That's the benefit." For the next several hours, Yuna gave Velana a tour of the ship's common areas. She wanted the alien to see how humans naturally interacted with each other throughout a normal day. What she hadn't expected was how strange these everyday behaviors would seem through alien eyes. In the cafeteria, they watched Communications Officer Hannah Lee chatting with pilot Do-hwan Kim while they ate lunch. When Do-hwan accidentally dropped his fork, Hannah handed him a new one from the supply station. Their fingers touched briefly as she passed it to him, and both smiled at the small moment of contact. Velana's scanner immediately activated. "Another unnecessary physical interaction detected," she announced loudly enough that several crew members turned to stare. The female could have placed the eating utensil on the table rather than making direct hand contact. The chosen method required 0.3 additional seconds and served no practical purpose. "But look at their faces," Yuna said quietly. "They're both smiling." That small touch made them feel connected to each other. Velana studied the two humans with intense focus, like a scientist examining fascinating but incomprehensible specimens. "I do not understand why feeling connected would be desirable if it serves no reproductive function." They continued walking through the ship, and everywhere they went, Velana discovered new behaviors that baffled her completely. She watched maintenance worker Seojun playfully ruffle his younger colleague's hair as they passed in the hallway. She observed botanist Hyejin giving a tired-looking friend a quick shoulder massage during their break. She saw engineer Minky helping elderly crew member Sung-hoon carry heavy equipment, even though it wasn't part of his job responsibilities. "Your species engages in constant, unnecessary physical contact," Velana finally declared, her voice filled with scientific bewilderment. "I have recorded 47 instances of purposeless touching in the past 3 hours, handshakes that last longer than required for greeting, embraces with no practical function, individuals placing hands on each other's shoulders or arms during conversation when such contact adds nothing to the information exchange. We call it affection." Una explained patiently. It serves emotional needs rather than biological ones. But emotions are merely chemical reactions in the brain, Velana replied. Why would your species deliberately trigger these reactions when they provide no survival advantage? Una paused, realizing how difficult it would be to explain something that felt so natural to humans. Because those chemical reactions make us feel good, they help us bond with each other and form stronger relationships. Stronger relationships for what purpose? For happiness, Una said simply. For companionship. For love. Velana stared at her for a long moment, then made more notes on her device. Clearly, the concept of doing something purely for emotional satisfaction was as foreign to her as breathing underwater would be to a human. 3 days into Velana's visit, the ship's communication system crackled to life with an emergency broadcast. From Earth, Captain Minsu's voice carried across every corridor, heavy with bad news that would change everything for several crew members. Attention all personnel. We've received reports of a major earthquake in the Busan metropolitan area. Magnitude 7.2. Several districts have been severely damaged. We're still gathering information about casualties, but we know that families of crew members So-min Choi, Jae-hyun Lim and Kyung-won Seo were in the affected zones during the event. The ship fell silent. Una felt her heart sink as she watched crew members' faces change from their usual cheerful expressions to looks of shock and worry. In the distance, she could hear someone crying, Velana, who had been following Una through her daily rounds, immediately activated her scanning device. Interesting, she commented clinically. The announcement of distant events has caused measurable stress responses in multiple subjects, despite their inability to influence the situation in any way. Una shot her a look. Those are their families, Velana. Of course they're worried. But worry serves no functional purpose when the subjects cannot take action, the alien replied, genuinely confused. This emotional response seems counterproductive. 20 minutes later, Una went looking for the crew members who had been named in the announcement. She found pilot So-min Choi sitting alone in the observation deck, staring out at the stars, with tears streaming down her face. The normally confident and cheerful woman looked completely broken. So-min? Una called softly as she entered the room. So-min looked up, her eyes red and swollen. I can't reach them, she whispered. I've been trying to call my parents for an hour, but all the communication lines are down. I don't know if they're okay. I don't know if they're hurt. I don't even know if they're still alive. Her voice broke on the last word, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Una's heart ached watching her friend fall apart. Without hesitation, she walked over and sat down beside So-min on the observation deck bench. Hey, Una said gently, placing a comforting hand on So-min's shoulder. It's going to be okay. You don't know that, So-min cried. Nobody knows that. They could be trapped under a building right now. They could be hurt and calling for help, and I'm not there. I'm millions of miles away in space, completely useless. Una didn't try to argue or offer false reassurances. Instead, she simply moved closer and pulled So-min into a warm embrace. She let her friend cry against her shoulder, stroking her hair, and murmuring soft, soothing words. I know you're scared, Una whispered. I know this feels terrible. But your parents are strong people. They've survived difficult things before. And even if the worst has happened, crying about it here won't change anything. All we can do is hope and wait for more information. From the doorway, Velana watched this entire interaction with intense fascination. Her scanning device recorded everything. Una's heart rate, So-min's stress hormone levels, the changes in both women's brain chemistry as the embrace continued. Fascinating, she murmured to herself, speaking so quietly that neither human could hear her. Dr. Kim gains absolutely nothing from this interaction. She expends energy comforting another individual without receiving any resources or benefits in return. Yet both subjects are showing improved physiological markers. Her device beeped softly as it detected the changes. So-min's cortisol levels were dropping. Her breathing was becoming more regular. Her heart rate was slowing down from its panicked pace. Even Una showed signs of increased oxytocin and decreased stress hormones. But something else was happening to Velana as she watched. For the first time since arriving on the human ship, she was experiencing a sensation she couldn't categorize or understand. A warm feeling was spreading through her chest, completely different from anything in her previous experience. The emotion was triggered by watching Yuna's compassionate response to Somin's pain. There was something about the selfless act of comfort that created an unfamiliar reaction in Velana's own body. It wasn't logical. It wasn't scientific. It was just a feeling, warm and slightly unsettling, that made her want to understand more about human emotional connections. She continued recording for another 10 minutes, watching as Yuna simply held her friend and let her cry. No practical solutions were offered. No logical analysis was provided. Yuna didn't try to fix the problem or make the situation better. She just offered her presence and emotional support. Eventually, Somin's tears began to slow. "Thank you," she whispered against Yuna's shoulder. "I needed that." "Of course," Yuna replied, giving her one final squeeze before letting go. That's what friends are for. Later that evening, Velana approached Yuna privately in the research lab. The alien woman seemed unusually hesitant, as if struggling with concepts she couldn't quite grasp. "Dr. Kim," she began carefully, "I observed your response to the distressed crew member today. Your behavior served no logical purpose that I can identify. You provided no practical assistance, offered no solutions to her problem, and gained no measurable benefits from the interaction." She paused, consulting her notes with obvious confusion. "Yet the interaction appeared to be beneficial. Both of your stress levels decreased significantly. The distressed individual showed marked improvement in emotional stability. I cannot explain these results using any of my species' understanding of efficient behavior." Yuna smiled gently. "Sometimes the most important things we do aren't logical at all." Over the following weeks, something strange began happening to Velana. She found herself wandering the corridors of the Harmony at odd hours, not because she had official research to conduct, but because she hoped to run into Yuna. When their scheduled meetings ended, she would linger in the research lab, asking unnecessary questions just to extend their time together. "I require additional clarification about human social customs," she would say, even when they had already covered that topic thoroughly. "Perhaps we could discuss this further tomorrow?" Yuna always agreed cheerfully, never seeming to notice that Velana's scientific curiosity had taken on a more personal quality. The alien told herself these extra meetings were purely for research purposes. She was gathering valuable data about human behavior that would be crucial for her final report. But deep down, even she was beginning to realize that excuse felt increasingly hollow. Their translation work had become the highlight of Velana's day. They would sit side by side at the research station, working through complex linguistic puzzles. As they tried to create better communication protocols between their species, the work was challenging, requiring intense concentration and collaboration. Velana had always prided herself on her focus and analytical abilities, but lately, she found herself getting distracted during their sessions. Instead of concentrating on the language data scrolling across their screens, she would catch herself watching Yuna's face as she worked. She noticed how Yuna's eyebrows would furrow slightly when she encountered a particularly difficult translation challenge. She observed the way Yuna would unconsciously bite her lower lip when deep in thought. Most distracting of all, she began to anticipate the moment when Yuna would solve a complex problem, and her entire expression would light up with satisfaction. It happened during their Tuesday afternoon session. They had been struggling for 2 hours with a HFY phrase that seemed to have no direct human equivalent. The concept involved a type of logical satisfaction that Yuna's species apparently didn't experience in the same way. "Wait," Yuna said suddenly, her fingers flying across the keyboard as a new idea struck her. "What if we approach this from the emotional angle instead of the logical one? Maybe the feeling you're describing is similar to what we call contentment or fulfillment." She worked for several more minutes, building a complex translation matrix that bridged the gap between HFY logic and human emotion. When the computer finally accepted her solution and displayed a successful translation, Yuna's face broke into the most beautiful smile Velana had ever seen. Got it! Una exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with triumph. At that exact moment, something unprecedented happened to Velana. Her pulse quickened dramatically. Her chest felt warm and tight. Her normally steady hands began to tremble slightly. For a few seconds, she couldn't think about anything except how lovely Una looked when she was happy. The physical reaction was so unexpected and intense that Velana actually gasped out loud. Una turned to look at her with concern. "Are you okay?" Una asked. "You look like something's wrong." "I am uncertain," Velana replied honestly, pressing a hand to her chest, where the strange warmth was still spreading. "I believe I may be experiencing some form of system malfunction." That evening, Velana made her way to the ship's medical bay. Medical Officer Do-hyun Seo was just finishing his shift when she appeared in the doorway, looking unusually uncertain, for someone who typically radiated confidence and control. "Dr. Seo," she said formally, "I request a comprehensive health scan." Do-hyun looked up from his paperwork, surprised. In the weeks since Velana had been aboard the ship, she had never requested medical attention. "Of course, what seems to be the problem?" "I am experiencing irregular physiological responses that I cannot explain," she admitted, sounding almost embarrassed. "Elevated heart rate, increased body temperature, difficulty concentrating, and unusual sensations in my chest cavity." Do-hyun gestured for her to sit on the examination table while he activated the medical scanners. "When do these symptoms occur?" Velana hesitated before answering. "Primarily when I am in the presence of Dr. Kim, also when I think about Dr. Kim, and sometimes when other crew members mention Dr. Kim in conversation." The medical scanner hummed quietly as it analyzed Velana's biological systems. After a few minutes, Do-hyun frowned at the results. "That's interesting. All of your vital signs appear to be perfectly normal. Actually, they're better than normal. Your stress hormones are lower than when you first arrived, and your overall physical condition seems to have improved. But the irregular responses I described, are you experiencing malfunction?" Do-hyun asked gently. Velana considered the question seriously. "Unknown," she finally admitted, disturbed by her body's rebellious responses to what should have been routine interactions with a research colleague. "Can you describe these chest sensations in more detail?" "It feels warm," Velana said slowly. "Not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. Sometimes it spreads to other parts of my body. When Dr. Kim smiles or laughs, the sensation intensifies significantly." Do-hyun tried to hide his smile as he realized what was happening. "Velana, I don't think you're malfunctioning. I think you might be experiencing something that's completely normal for humans, but apparently new for your species." "What do you mean?" "I think you're developing feelings for Una. Romantic feelings." The words hit Velana like a physical blow. She stared at Do-hyun in shock, her mind racing as she tried to process this impossible suggestion. "That cannot be correct," she said firmly. "Kethaval do not experience such irregularities. We form partnerships based on logical compatibility and reproductive efficiency. Emotional attachment is counterproductive and has been eliminated from our social development." "Maybe it was suppressed, not eliminated," Do-hyun suggested carefully. "Maybe you've always had the capacity for these feelings, but your society never allowed you to acknowledge or explore them." Velana left the medical bay more confused than when she had arrived. As she walked back to her quarters, she tried to convince herself that Do-hyun was wrong. But deep down, a part of her was beginning to suspect he might be right. The next morning arrived with Velana feeling more confused than she had ever been in her entire life. She had spent the night lying in her assigned quarters, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what Dr. Seo had told her. Romantic feelings, for a human? The very idea seemed impossible, yet she couldn't deny the strange things happening to her body and mind. She arrived at their usual morning research session 15 minutes early, which was unusual even for someone as punctual as Velana. When Una walked into the lab with her typical bright smile and cheerful "Good morning," Velana felt that familiar warm sensation spread through her chest again. This time, instead of trying to ignore it or categorize it as a malfunction, she paid careful attention to exactly what was happening. Her heart rate increased by approximately 23%. Her skin temperature rose by 2 degrees. Most disturbing of all, she felt a strong desire to move closer to Yuna, to somehow be near her in a way that had nothing to do with their scientific work. They worked in relative silence for the first hour, translating a series of HFY cultural documents that would help humans understand her species better. But Velana found it nearly impossible to concentrate. Every time Yuna leaned over to point at something on the screen, every time their hands accidentally brushed while reaching for the same datapad, every time Yuna laughed at one of her own translation mistakes, Velana felt those same overwhelming sensations. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. The internal conflict between what she had been taught her entire life and what she was currently experiencing had reached a breaking point. "Dr. Kim," she said suddenly, interrupting Yuna mid-sentence as she explained a particularly complex grammatical structure. "Yes?" Yuna looked up from her work, immediately noticing the tension in Velana's voice. "I believe I am experiencing system failure," Velana confessed, the words coming out in a rush before she could lose her courage. Yuna immediately set down her datapad and turned to face Velana completely, giving her full attention. The concerned expression on her face only made Velana's heart beat faster. "What kind of failure?" Yuna asked gently. Velana took what humans would call a deep breath, though for her species it was more of a deliberate oxygenation process. "When you smile, my cardiovascular system accelerates beyond normal parameters. When you laugh, I experience a pleasant sensation that I cannot categorize using any of my existing knowledge frameworks. When you are absent from my immediate vicinity, I find myself incomplete." The admission cost Velana considerable effort. Her voice became quieter with each word, and by the end she was looking down at her hands rather than meeting Yuna's eyes. On her homeworld, such feelings would be considered a serious malfunction requiring immediate correction through medical intervention. "Yesterday, during our translation work, when you solved the complex linguistic puzzle and displayed satisfaction, I experienced what I can only describe as overwhelming positive stimulation," she continued, forcing herself to be completely honest. "My pulse increased to dangerous levels. I felt temperature fluctuations throughout my body. Most concerning of all, I found myself wanting to touch you, to somehow share in your moment of achievement." She finally looked up at Yuna, her large dark eyes filled with confusion and something that looked almost like fear. "These responses serve no logical purpose. They interfere with my ability to conduct proper research. They represent a fundamental breakdown in my species' emotional control systems." Yuna listened to this entire confession with growing understanding and compassion. When Velana finished speaking, she was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Those aren't failures," Yuna said gently, her voice soft and reassuring. "Those are emotions. Specifically, you might be developing feelings of attraction and affection." "That is impossible," Velana replied immediately, though her voice lacked conviction. "HFY do not experience such irregularities. We have evolved beyond the need for emotional bonds that serve no reproductive purpose." "Maybe you haven't evolved beyond them," Yuna suggested carefully. "Maybe you've just been taught to suppress them so thoroughly that you forgot they existed." Velana stared at her for a long moment. "Are you suggesting that my entire species has been incorrect about our own nature?" "I'm suggesting that maybe emotions aren't the weakness your people think they are," Yuna replied. "Maybe they're actually a strength that you've been denying yourselves." The idea was revolutionary and terrifying. If Yuna was right, it meant that everything Velana had been taught about proper HFY behavior was fundamentally flawed. It meant that generations of her people had lived their lives suppressing a natural part of themselves. But if these feelings serve no reproductive function, why would they exist? Velana asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because they serve other functions," Yuna explained patiently. "They help us form deeper connections with other people. They make us want to care for each other, protect each other, and share our lives together. They make life more meaningful and beautiful." "Beautiful," Velana repeated the word slowly, as if tasting something new. "This is another concept my species does not recognize. We understand efficiency, logic, and function. But beauty, "What do you feel when you look at the stars through the observation deck windows?" Yuna asked. Velana considered the question. "I feel peaceful, curious. Sometimes I experience a sensation that makes me want to continue looking, even when I have gathered all necessary astronomical data. That's appreciation for beauty," Yuna said with a small smile. "You've been feeling emotions all along. You just didn't have words for them." The realization hit Velana like a wave. All those moments throughout her life when she had experienced sensations that didn't fit into her species' rigid categories. All those times she had felt something beyond mere logical satisfaction. They hadn't been malfunctions or errors in her programming. They had been emotions. And now, sitting here with Yuna, she was feeling the strongest emotions of her entire ex. Despite the confusion and fear that Yuna's revelations had stirred up inside her, Velana found herself unable to stop, watching human relationships with new eyes. What had once seemed like pointless inefficiency now appeared to contain hidden layers of meaning that she was desperate to understand. The next afternoon, she discovered Chef Kyung-hoon No in the ship's kitchen, teaching his partner Ji-hoon how to prepare traditional Korean bulgogi. Velana positioned herself in the doorway, activating her recording device out of habit, though she was no longer sure if this was truly scientific observation or something else entirely. Kyung-hoon stood directly behind Ji-hoon, his arms wrapped around his partner's waist as he guided Ji-hoon's hands in slicing the meat to the proper thickness. Their bodies were pressed close together, sharing warmth and space in a way that served no practical purpose. Kyung-hoon could have easily demonstrated the technique from beside Ji-hoon, or simply given verbal instructions from across the kitchen. "The key is to cut against the grain," Kyung-hoon murmured softly, his lips close to Ji-hoon's ear. "Like this. Feel how the knife moves differently?" Ji-hoon laughed as he struggled with the unfamiliar technique, and when he finally managed to cut a perfect slice, both men celebrated as if he had accomplished something truly significant. They kissed briefly, tasting the marinade from each other's fingers, completely absorbed in their shared moment of domestic happiness. Velana watched this entire scene with growing fascination. The physical closeness between the two men was completely unnecessary for the task at hand. The teaching process would have been more efficient if conducted with appropriate distance and formal instruction. Yet both subjects appeared to be experiencing elevated levels of satisfaction and bonding that went far beyond mere cooking education. "Fascinating," she murmured to herself, making notes on her device. "They are choosing inefficiency because it increases their emotional connection." Later that evening, Yuna approached Velana with an invitation that would have seemed routine to any human crew member, but felt revolutionary to the alien woman. "We're having our monthly entertainment evening tonight," Yuna explained. "Some of the crew members are going to perform music and poetry. Would you like to attend? I think it might help you understand more about human emotional expression." Velana's first instinct was to decline. Attending a recreational activity that served no research purpose went against everything she had been taught about proper behavior. But the growing curiosity inside her, combined with her desire to spend more time with Yuna, overrode her logical objections. "I will attend," she said, immediately feeling like she was making a dangerous decision. For scientific observation purposes. Even as she said it, she knew the excuse was becoming thinner each day. The ship's main recreation room had been transformed for the evening's entertainment. Soft lighting created a warm, intimate atmosphere, completely different from the clinical brightness that Velana preferred. Crew members sat in comfortable groups, some holding hands, others leaning against each other, in casual displays of affection that Velana was beginning to recognize as normal human behavior. She sat beside Yuna, on a cushioned bench, hyper-aware of how close they were sitting and how natural it felt. When the first performer took the small makeshift stage, Velana activated her recording device and prepared to analyze another example of human inefficiency. Engineer Min-jae Kim stepped forward carrying a violin, the same man she had observed, earlier helping his colleagues with routine maintenance tasks. Now he appeared completely transformed, his usual work clothes replaced with formal attire that served no practical purpose except to mark this as a special occasion. "This piece is called Spring Rain," he announced to the gathered audience. "I wrote it for my daughter back on Earth who loves to dance in the rain." He raised the violin to his shoulder and began to play. The melody that filled the room was unlike anything Velana had ever experienced. It was complex and beautiful, rising and falling like the weather patterns it was meant to represent. As she listened, she felt that same warm sensation in her chest that she was learning to associate with human emotions. "Why do they do this?" she whispered to Yuna, as the music surrounded them. "This activity produces no resources. It solves no problems. It serves no reproductive or survival function." "Because it makes them happy," Yuna replied softly, her own face glowing with appreciation for the beautiful music. "Because sharing beauty with others creates connection between people." Velana watched the faces of the crew members around her as they listened to Minje's performance. Some had their eyes closed, completely absorbed in the emotional experience. Others were smiling or swaying gently to the rhythm. A few were holding hands with their partners, sharing the moment of beauty together. "But beauty is subjective," Velana protested quietly. "It cannot be measured or quantified. How can something so imprecise be valuable?" "Maybe the most valuable things can't be measured," Yuna suggested. "Maybe that's what makes them precious." As the violin music continued, Velana found herself experiencing something completely unprecedented. The logical part of her mind understood that she was simply hearing vibrations in the air at specific frequencies. But another part of her, a part she was only beginning to discover, was responding to something deeper in the music. She felt the sadness in the minor keys and the joy in the major progressions. She sensed the longing in the sustained notes and the playfulness in the quick passages. Most surprising of all, she found herself imagining the child dancing in the rain, a human she had never met, but could somehow picture through her father's musical love letter. "I think I understand," she whispered to Yuna as the final notes faded away. "The music creates shared emotional experience even when the listeners have different backgrounds and perspectives." "Exactly," Yuna smiled, clearly pleased that Velana was beginning to grasp these concepts. "It connects us to each other and to something larger than ourselves." As the evening continued with more performances, Velana realized she was witnessing something her species had lost or perhaps never allowed themselves to discover. These humans weren't just existing together. They were creating meaning and joy through shared experiences that served no practical purpose except to make life more beautiful. For the first time since arriving on the ship, she began to wonder if her people had made a terrible mistake in choosing pure logic over emotional connection. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, transmitted through the Kethval's advanced communication system that could reach across vast distances of space instantaneously. Velana received it in her quarters, the familiar symbols of her native language appearing on her personal device in the cold, official tone she remembered from her homeworld. "Research subject Velana," the message began, using the formal designation, rather than any personal greeting. "Your assigned cultural observation period aboard the human vessel has reached its scheduled conclusion. You are required to return to Kethval Prime within 7 standard cycles to submit your findings and undergo mandatory post-contact psychological evaluation." Velana stared at the message for several minutes, reading and rereading the words that would change everything. The post-contact evaluation was standard procedure for any Kethval who spent extended time among alien species. It was designed to detect and correct any psychological contamination that might have occurred during exposure to foreign cultures. The evaluation would scan her mind thoroughly, identifying any emotional responses that deviated from proper Kethval norms. Any feelings of attachment, affection, or emotional bonding would be classified as dangerous irregularities, requiring immediate medical intervention. The correction process was efficient and painless, but it was also permanent. She would return to her homeworld as the same logical, emotionally controlled being she had always been. All of these new sensations she had been experiencing would be removed as if they had never existed. An hour later, she found Yuna in their usual research lab, organizing the cultural exchange data they had been compiling together. When Velana entered the room, Yuna looked up with that familiar warm smile that had become such an important part of Velana's daily experience. Good morning, Yuna said cheerfully. I was thinking we could work on the family structure comparisons today. I found some really interesting parallels between... She stopped mid-sentence when she noticed Velana's expression. What's wrong? You look upset. Velana had never heard anyone describe her as looking upset before. On her homeworld, emotional states were not visible on Kethval faces, carefully controlled and suppressed from childhood. But apparently her time among humans had changed even that fundamental aspect of her behavior. I have received communication from my homeworld, she said, her voice unusually quiet. I am required to return within 7 days for post-contact. Evaluation? That sounds routine, Yuna replied, though something in Velana's tone made her concerned. You'll be able to present all your research about human culture. They'll probably be very interested in what you've learned. Yes, Velana said slowly. They will be very interested in what I have learned, and they will remove it. Yuna's expression changed to one of confusion and growing alarm. What do you mean, remove it? The post-contact evaluation includes psychological scanning and correction. Procedures, Velana explained, sitting down heavily in her usual chair. Any emotional responses or attachments that I have developed during my time here will be identified as contamination. They will be eliminated through medical intervention to restore my proper Kethval psychological state. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Yuna stared at Velana with growing horror as she understood what this meant. They will remove these feelings, Velana continued, her voice becoming even quieter. The warmth I experience when you smile, the pleasure I find in our conversations, the sense of connection I have never experienced before in my life, all of it will be taken away, and I will return to being the person I was before I met you. Is that what you want? Yuna asked gently. The question hit Velana like a physical blow. She had expected Yuna to accept this news as an unfortunate, but necessary procedure, the way any logical being would. But instead, Yuna was asking her to examine her own desires, to consider what she personally wanted rather than what was expected of her. Velana struggled with the question in a way that would have been impossible just a few weeks earlier. Everything in her upbringing, everything she had been taught about proper Kethval behavior, said that yes, of course she wanted to return to her normal psychological state. Emotions were inefficient, distracting, and potentially dangerous. Logical thinking was superior in every way, but as she considered the possibility of losing these new sensations, she felt something she was learning to recognize as grief. The thought of never again experiencing the joy of watching Yuna solve a difficult problem, never again feeling that warm connection when they worked together, never again caring about another being's happiness beyond its practical utility, filled her with a sadness so profound it almost took her breath away. I do not know, she finally admitted, and even saying those words felt like a revolutionary act. For my entire life, the answer would have been obvious. I would have wanted to return to proper Kethval emotional control immediately. She looked up at Yuna, her large dark eyes filled with confusion and something that looked like fear. But now when I imagine losing the ability to feel connected to you, to experience joy when you are happy, to care about your well-being, beyond its practical implications, the thought causes me significant distress. That distress you're feeling, Yuna said softly, that's because these emotions have become part of who you are. They're not contamination or malfunction. They're growth. They're you becoming more fully yourself. But if I do not return for evaluation, I will be classified as psychologically compromised, Velana said. I will not be permitted to return to Kethval society. I will essentially be exiled from my own species. The weight of the choice before her was staggering. Return home and lose everything she had discovered about herself, or stay and lose everything she had known about her identity and place in the universe. For the first time in her life, Velana faced a decision that couldn't be made through logical analysis alone. She would have to choose based on what she felt, on what mattered to her personally, on what kind of being she wanted to become. The choice terrified her more than anything she had ever experienced. The next 3 days were the longest of Velana's life. She spent sleepless hours in her quarters, pacing back and forth as she wrestled with the most difficult decision she had ever faced. Every logical pathway in her mind led to the same conclusion. She should return home, undergo the evaluation, and resume her normal life as a proper Kethval citizen. But her heart, a concept she was only beginning to understand, pulled her in a completely different direction. On the fourth day, she made a choice that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She requested a formal meeting with Captain Seungmin Bai, the commanding officer of the Harmony. No Kethval in recorded history had ever made such a request during a cultural exchange mission. Captain Bai received her in his private office, a comfortable space decorated with photos of Earth and mementos from his years exploring space. He was a kind man in his 50s, with gentle eyes and a calm demeanor that had earned him respect throughout the fleet. Captain Bai, Velana began, standing at formal attention as she had been taught. I wish to make an unprecedented request. Please sit down, the captain said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. What can I do for you? Velana remained standing, her posture rigid with nervous energy. I request extended cultural exchange status aboard the Harmony. I wish to continue my research into human emotional and social systems for an indefinite period. Captain Bai's eyebrows rose in surprise. In his 25 years of diplomatic service, he had never heard of a visiting alien requesting to extend their stay. That's certainly unusual, he said carefully. May I ask what has prompted this request? I believe my species has made a fundamental error, Velana stated formally, her voice carrying the weight of a revolutionary discovery. We have categorized emotional connection as inefficiency and potential contamination. However, my observations aboard this vessel suggest that emotional bonding enhances rather than diminishes relationship stability and personal fulfillment. She activated her personal data device and projected a series of charts and graphs into the air between them. The data represented weeks of careful observation and analysis, translated into the kind of logical presentation that would make sense to both human and Kethval minds. I have conducted extensive research on human pair bonding behaviors, she continued, her scientific training taking over as she presented her findings. Human couples who demonstrate strong emotional connections show measurably better cooperation in problem-solving scenarios. They communicate more effectively during stress situations. Their partnerships last significantly longer than relationships, based purely on practical considerations. Captain Bai studied the data with growing interest. The charts showed correlation patterns between emotional intimacy and relationship success that were remarkably consistent across the entire crew. This couple, Velana said, highlighting specific data points, Engineer Kyung-hoon and his partner Ji-hoon have been together for 8 Earth years. Their emotional bond score, based on my observational metrics, rates in the highest category. During the recent emergency with the navigation system failure, they worked together with 96% efficiency, communicating complex technical information with minimal errors. She switched to another data set. Compare this to theoretical Kethval partnerships, which are arranged based on genetic compatibility and logical resource management. Average partnership duration is 3.2 years before dissolution. Cooperation efficiency during stress events averages only 71%. The implications of her research were staggering. She was essentially arguing that her entire species had been wrong about one of the most fundamental aspects of social organization. Your data is quite compelling, Captain Bai said thoughtfully, but I have to ask, what will happen if you don't return to your homeworld as scheduled? I will be classified as psychologically compromised and banned from Kethval society, Velana replied matter-of-factly. However, I believe the potential benefits of continuing this research outweigh the personal costs. She paused, and for the first time since entering his office, her formal composure cracked slightly. Captain, I have discovered something aboard your ship that my people believe does not exist. I have experienced personal fulfillment that goes beyond logical satisfaction. I have formed connections with other beings that make me want to protect their well-being even when I gain nothing in return. Her voice became softer, more vulnerable. Dr. Kim has shown me that relationships can be based on mutual care and emotional support, rather than simple resource exchange. I have observed crew members sacrificing their own comfort to help others, not because they are required to, but because they choose to. I have witnessed the creation of beauty for its own sake, and I have felt joy in sharing that beauty with others. Captain Bay listened to this confession with growing understanding. He had seen other beings discover the power of human emotional connection during cultural exchanges, but never with such dramatic results. Most importantly, Velana continued, I believe this research could revolutionize Kethval society. If I can prove that emotional bonding creates stronger, more stable relationships, it might convince my people to reconsider their entire approach to social organization. She looked directly at Captain Bay, her large eyes filled with determination and hope. I am requesting the opportunity to become the first Kethval to choose emotional growth over psychological conformity. I want to continue learning about human connection not just as a scientist, but as a being who has discovered she is capable of love. The word love hung in the air between them. It was the first time Velana had used that term to describe her own experiences, and saying it out loud felt like crossing a line from which there would be no return. Captain Bay was quiet for a long moment, considering the unprecedented request and its implications for both species. Finally, he smiled warmly. Request approved, Velana. Welcome to extended cultural exchange status aboard the Harmony. For the first time since arriving on the human ship, Velana allowed herself to smile back. 8 months had passed since Velana made the most important decision of her life. The research vessel Harmony continued its deep space mission, but for Velana, it had become something far more significant than a temporary assignment. It had become home. She stood in the laboratory she now shared permanently with Yuna, reviewing data that would have been impossible for her to collect in her previous emotional state. Her research had expanded far beyond simple observation of human behavior. She was now documenting the measurable benefits of emotional connection in ways that even the most logical Kethval mind could understand. The stress response data is fascinating, she said to Yuna, who was working at the adjacent station. When crew member Jiwan received news of his promotion last week, his partner Sang-woo showed decreased cortisol levels and increased oxytocin production despite receiving no direct benefit himself. Yuna looked up from her own work with a smile that still made Velana's heart rate increase, though she no longer considered this response a malfunction. That's what we call being happy for someone else's success. Yes, Velana nodded, making notes in her research log. Empathetic joy, a response that serves no individual survival purpose, but strengthens social bonds and community stability. Their working relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected when they first met. What had begun as clinical cultural exchange had developed into a partnership built on mutual respect, shared curiosity, and something Velana was now comfortable calling love. They had not rushed into physical intimacy the way some human couples did. Instead, their bond had grown slowly and naturally, based on intellectual connection and emotional understanding. Velana had needed time to explore these new feelings at her own pace, and Yuna had been patient and supportive throughout the process. Now, as they worked side by side each day, Velana experienced a contentment she had never imagined possible. The simple pleasure of sharing discoveries with someone who understood and appreciated her work, the comfort of having someone who cared about her well-being, the joy of making another person happy through small gestures of affection, these experiences had become the foundation of her new understanding of what life could be. "Are you happy?" Yuna asked suddenly, looking up from her data analysis. It was a question she had asked several times over the months, always with genuine curiosity about Velana's emotional development. Each time, Velana's answer had become more confident and more complete. Velana considered the question with the same analytical precision she once applied to dismissing emotion. She examined her current psychological state, her satisfaction with her work, her feelings about her relationships with the crew, and most importantly, her deep connection with Yuna. "Yes," she said finally, her response carrying the weight of months of self-discovery. "I am experiencing fulfillment that extends far beyond biological imperatives or logical satisfaction." She turned away from her workstation to face Yuna directly. "When I first arrived on this ship, I believed that efficiency and logic were the highest goals of intelligent life. I thought emotions were weaknesses that interfered with optimal function. And now? Yuna prompted gently. Now I understand that emotions are not obstacles to overcome but capabilities to develop, Velana replied. The capacity for love, joy, empathy, and connection doesn't diminish intelligence. It enhances it, by providing motivation and meaning that pure logic cannot supply. Her research had indeed continued, but with a completely different focus than originally intended. Instead of documenting human inefficiencies, she was now developing frameworks that could help her species integrate emotional intimacy with their existing social structures. The preliminary data was revolutionary. Look at these correlation patterns, she said, pulling up her latest analysis. Relationships that incorporate both logical compatibility and emotional connection produce outcomes superior to either approach alone. Partnership stability increases by 47%. Problem-solving efficiency improves by 32%. Individual satisfaction and psychological health show dramatic improvements across all measured categories. The implications were staggering. If her research was correct, the Kethval species had been limiting their own potential for millennia by suppressing their emotional capabilities. I've been thinking about submitting a proposal to the Kethval Scientific Council, Velana continued, her voice carrying excitement about the possibility. Not as a cultural exchange report, but as a fundamental challenge to our species' understanding of optimal social organization. Yuna's eyes widened with understanding of how significant this would be. That would be incredibly brave, and potentially dangerous. Perhaps, Velana agreed, but I believe I have an obligation to share what I have learned. If even a small number of Kethval individuals could experience what I have experienced, it might begin a transformation of our entire society. She looked around the laboratory that had become her sanctuary, then back at Yuna, whose presence had made all of this discovery possible. I used to believe that the highest achievement of intelligent life was perfect logical control, she said softly. Now I know that the highest achievement is the ability to choose love over fear, connection over isolation, and growth over stagnation. As if to demonstrate her point, she reached across the space between their workstations and took Yuna's hand in hers. The simple gesture, which would have been incomprehensible to her former self, now felt like the most natural thing in the universe. Whatever response my research receives from the Kethval Council, she continued, I know that I have found something here that is worth any sacrifice. I have found not just knowledge, but wisdom. Not just efficiency, but meaning. Not just existence, but truly living. The research vessel Harmony continued its journey through the stars, carrying within its corridors the seeds of a revolution that might someday transform an entire species. And at the heart of that revolution was one alien woman who had dared to choose love over logic, and in doing so, had discovered that the two were not opposites at all. They were partners in the greatest exploration of all, the journey toward becoming fully, authentically alive. Istance.